Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. This time, we're going to be tackling the legal battle surrounding Pfizer's COVID-19 vaccine.
It's definitely a complex one with lawsuits happening in the US.
Lawsuits.
Yeah, and even some folks across the pond in Europe are raising questions too.
Wow.
We're also going to dig into how big organizations like the Gates Foundation have been involved in the global response to the whole pandemic.
So starting off, what's happening with this Texas lawsuit? I know that Attorney General Ken Paxton, he's got some pretty serious things to say about Pfizer.
Yeah, he's claiming that Pfizer, well, they didn't really tell the whole truth about how effective and how safe the vaccine actually was.
So is he saying they kind of pressured Americans to get the vaccine?
That's what he's saying. He says they did it without giving people all the facts about the risks involved.
And on top of that, he's also saying that Pfizer teamed up with social media companies to quiet anyone who spoke out against the vaccine.
It's a big claim, for sure.
It is.
It really boils down to who gets to say what's true and what's not, especially during a global health crisis, you know.
Right.
The lawsuit also brings up how Pfizer showed their data early on, focusing a lot on relative risk reduction. Remember when everyone was talking about the 95% efficacy rate?
Oh, yeah, I remember those headlines. They were everywhere.
Well, both Paxton's lawsuit and actually the FDA itself have said that just looking at relative risk reduction can be really misleading.
Misleading. How so?
Well, they didn't provide all the long-term data, so it's kind of like imagine a disease affects, say, 1 in 10,000 people,
Okay.
and then a vaccine, it reduces that risk, but only to 1 in 20,000.
Hmm.
So yeah, the relative risk reduction looks huge, 50%, right?
Yeah, that sounds pretty good.
It sounds good, but the actual change in your own personal risk is super tiny.
Oh, I get it. So those big, impressive numbers, sometimes they don't tell the whole story.
Exactly. So with all these accusations flying around, how did Pfizer respond?
Well, according to the lawsuit, they tried to shut down anyone who disagreed with them by calling it misinformation.
It's interesting. It's like a battle of who's telling the truth, right? Each side saying the other is twisting the facts.
Yeah, but, we got to remember these are just accusations at this point. We'll have to see what the courts decide.
Right.
Now, there's another lawsuit happening in Kansas, right?
Uh-huh.
And that one focuses on specific health risks that might be linked to the vaccine. What's the story there?
Well, they're particularly looking into potential issues during pregnancy and some heart-related problems like myocarditis.
Myocarditis.
Yeah, it's when the heart muscle gets inflamed, making it harder for the heart to pump blood properly. It's often caused by viruses, but some studies are suggesting a possible link to certain COVID-19 vaccines.
Interesting. So both lawsuits are raising concerns about how well the vaccine actually works and also potential side effects. And this isn't just a U.S. thing either. It sounds like people in Europe are asking for more transparency about the Pfizer vaccine as well.
That's right. The European Parliament, they're asking if the European Commission is going to really look into these potential risks. They're even wondering if they should take legal action against Pfizer or other manufacturers if these risks are serious.
So it seems like there's this global trend. People everywhere are worried about how open Pfizer's been and what the potential downsides of the vaccine are.
Yeah.
But this also brings up a bigger point, doesn't it? What about organizations like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation? What role have they played in how the world has handled this whole pandemic?
That's a good point. There was an investigation by Politico and Welt recently. They found out that the Gates Foundation, along with a few other NGOs like Gavi and CEPI, were really involved in decisions about making and distributing the vaccines.
So these are private organizations, but they're having a big influence on a global level. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, it raises some important questions, right?
Yeah.
About who's holding them accountable and how transparent they're being. When you have these groups funded by private money with so much power in global health, you have to take a close look at what they're doing and see if there are any conflicts of interest.
That makes perfect sense. We're talking about decisions that affect millions of people. So we have to know who's making those calls and why.
Exactly, and that's where the Politico and Welt investigation is really helpful. They dug deep to understand just how involved the Gates Foundation was in the global pandemic response.
So it sounds like they really went all in on this. What did they find out?
One of the biggest things was the sheer amount of money the Gates Foundation put into COVID-19 initiatives.
How much are we talking?
Almost $10 billion since 2020.
Wow, $10 billion.
That's a huge amount, even compared to what leading U.S. government agencies spent fighting COVID-19 overseas. With that kind of money, they definitely have a big say in things.
So what exactly did they spend that money on? Did their funding align with what the world needed? Or were there other agendas at play?
Those are great questions, and that's exactly what the investigation looked at. A big chunk of their funding, something like $1.4 billion, went straight to the World Health
To
Organization.
the WHO.
Yeah, but it wasn't just a simple donation. They were actively involved in shaping key initiatives, including the ACT Accelerator, that's the ACTA. It was meant to make sure everyone, especially in poorer countries, could get access to COVID-19 tests, treatments, and those vaccines.
So they were essentially shaping the global response to the pandemic, not just by funding it, but by actually getting involved in these initiatives themselves.
That's right.
So the Gates Foundation, it seems like they were trying to solve global problems. But did they succeed?
Well, the ACTA, it had great goals, but the investigation found that it didn't actually meet a lot of its own targets.
Oh, that's a shame.
Yeah, it missed delivery goals across the board, meaning a lot of vulnerable people didn't get the help they needed when they needed it.
Hmm.
So even with all the money from the Gates Foundation, the promise of fair distribution wasn't really kept.
That is disheartening. It makes you wonder if these organizations, even with the best intentions and all those resources, are the right way to tackle global health problems.
It's a good question, and maybe there needs to be more accountability to make sure they're really helping the people they're trying to help.
You make a good point. Accountability is key when we're talking about organizations with this much power. What else did this investigation uncover?
Well, they also found that the Gates Foundation was heavily involved in lobbying lawmakers, both in the US and in Europe, to get billions of dollars in funding for their projects.
So not only were they shaping the global response, but they were also actively working to keep their influence and funding going.
It's definitely one way to look at it, and it makes the whole situation even more complicated. And get this, there's this revolving door between the Gates Foundation and government positions.
What do you mean by revolving door?
Well, people who used to work for the WHO now work for the Gates Foundation and vice versa. So these powerful networks are getting even stronger.
It's starting to feel like this tangled web, isn't it? You've got these organizations, governments, and even pharmaceutical companies all mixed up together. It's hard to tell who's really calling the shots.
It's complicated, that's for sure. And that's exactly why being transparent is so important. Without it, people's trust, which is already kind of shaky, gets even worse.
I agree. People's lives are at stake here. They have a right to know how these decisions are being made, who's benefiting, and who's being left behind.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And this leads us to another interesting part of the story, this whole debate about intellectual property waivers.
Right, right. During the worst of the pandemic, there was this big push, especially from developing countries, to drop those intellectual property protections on the COVID-19 vaccine.
Yeah,
The idea was to let more countries manufacture those vaccines themselves, right?
exactly. They saw it as a way to make sure everyone had a fair chance of getting the vaccine.
Makes sense. But I remember the Gates Foundation, along with some Western governments and those big pharma companies, they weren't on board with this idea.
That's right. They said that waiving those intellectual property rights wouldn't actually make things faster. In fact, they said it could actually slow down how quickly we can make vaccines in the future.
So they were against it. Interesting. Why would they be against something that could potentially save so many lives?
Their argument was that the real problem wasn't the patents themselves, but the ability to actually make the vaccines. They said that even if other countries were allowed to produce them, they wouldn't have the facilities or the know-how to do it effectively.
But wouldn't letting other countries make the vaccines increase how many we could make overall?
That was the other side of the argument for sure, and it caused a lot of tension. People accused the Gates Foundation of putting the profits of drug companies ahead of people's health, especially in such a serious situation.
It's a shame that during a global pandemic, something as important as a life-saving vaccine became caught up in these power struggles. It feels like we're at a crossroads, don't you think? We've seen the incredible things science can do, developing vaccines so quickly.
It is incredible.
But we've also seen how things can go wrong when those advancements get mixed up with power dynamics and a lack of transparency.
You've summed it up perfectly. It's a reminder that science alone isn't enough. We need to make sure ethical considerations, public trust, and democratic accountability are built into how we prepare for and respond to pandemics.
So when we think about the Pfizer lawsuits and these investigations, what lessons can we learn from them as we navigate this new landscape?
Well, I think the Pfizer cases really highlight how important it is to have long-term data and not jump to conclusions based on early findings. Remember that initial 95% efficacy rate?
Yeah.
Well, that was based on a pretty short period of time. As more data came out, things got more complicated. Concerns about side effects and how long immunity lasts started to emerge.
It reminds us that science is always evolving. We can't rush to say something's definitely true, especially when it comes to something as important as a new vaccine.
Exactly. And these cases also show how important it is to communicate clearly. We need to avoid hype and be upfront about what we don't know. People deserve to understand both the good and the bad without feeling pressured or misled.
That's where transparency comes in, right?
Yes.
People need reliable information from different sources so they can make informed decisions about their health.
You're right, and everyone's responsible for that. Scientists, governments, healthcare providers, even those social media platforms, they all play part in stopping misinformation and creating a culture where people can talk openly and honestly about evidence-based information.
It's a big challenge, but we have to do it if we're going to rebuild trust and make sure we're better prepared to handle future pandemics in a fairer and more effective way.
I agree. We can't just focus on making new vaccines and treatments. We need to invest in the infrastructure, figure out how to communicate better, and work together globally to make sure those advancements actually reach the people who need them most, no matter where they live.
This has been a really insightful deep dive. I feel like I have a much better grasp of how complicated these Pfizer lawsuits are, and it's made me think about the bigger picture of global health, too.
It is a big picture.
But before we wrap up, I'd love to hear from you, the listener. What are your thoughts on all this?
We're always interested to hear what you think. What stood out to you? What questions do you still have? And if you have any ideas for future deep dives, let us know. We believe that knowledge is power, and we want to make sure you have the information you need to navigate this complex world.
Absolutely. We're all in this together. Let's learn from each other and work towards a healthier future for everyone.
This whole situation, it's really sparked a lot of debate, that's for sure.
Definitely.
And there are strong opinions all over the place, but, having these tough conversations, even when they're uncomfortable, that's super important, especially if we want to learn from all of this and be better prepared for the next pandemic, whenever that might be.
Yeah, I totally agree. Ignoring the issue won't help anyone. We need to be honest with ourselves, look closely at what happened, and that includes understanding what role powerful organizations like the Gates Foundation played. This investigation by Politico and Wealth, it really sheds light on their actions, and it's definitely got people talking.
It has. And one of the most controversial things they did was their stance on those intellectual property waivers for the COVID-19 vaccines. Remember, we talked about how there was a big push, especially from developing countries, to temporarily lift those protections so that more countries could make the vaccines themselves.
Yeah,
They saw that as a key step towards making sure everyone around the world had equal access.
makes sense. But the Gates Foundation, along with some Western governments and those pharmaceutical companies, they weren't too keen on that idea.
Nope, they weren't. They argued that waiving those intellectual property rights wouldn't actually speed up production. They said the real bottleneck was the actual capacity to manufacture the vaccines, not the patents themselves.
So they were saying, even if more countries could legally make the vaccines, they didn't have the resources or the knowledge to do it effectively.
Right, and they also worried that waiving those protections could discourage future innovation in the pharmaceutical industry.
So basically, they were saying that protecting those companies' profits was necessary to make sure we get new drugs and vaccines developed in the long run.
Yeah, that was their reasoning.
But a lot of people saw that as putting profit before people's lives, especially in the middle of a pandemic that was causing so much suffering.
It was a complicated issue, for sure, with valid points on both sides. It really highlighted the struggle between encouraging innovation and the moral obligation to make sure everyone has access to life-saving treatments. Ultimately, it was up to individual governments to decide whether to waive those intellectual property rights, and there wasn't a global agreement on what to do.
It's a shame that this became such a divisive issue when we really needed everyone to work together. It just shows how important it is to have those tough conversations and find a way to balance those competing interests for the good of everyone.
Absolutely. We need to find a system that encourages innovation, but also ensures that the results of that innovation, especially when it comes to global health, are available to everyone who needs them.
And that brings us back to transparency, doesn't it? If organizations like the Gates Foundation are going to have so much influence on global health policy, they need to be held accountable for their actions.
Couldn't agree more. Transparency is key to building trust and making sure these decisions are actually helping humanity as a whole.
And transparency isn't just about disclosing finances or making public statements. It's about having open discussions, welcoming different viewpoints, and being willing to admit mistakes and change course when needed.
Exactly. And it's not just on these organizations to be transparent. Governments and regulatory bodies need to step up too and provide more oversight to make sure public health decisions are being made fairly and ethically.
It sounds like we need a pretty big shift in how we handle global health challenges.
I think you're right. We can't just keep reacting to crises as they happen. We need to be more proactive, think long-term, and focus on prevention, preparedness, and making sure everyone has equal access.
What would that look like in practice?
Well, it would mean investing in strong public health systems in all countries, not just the wealthy ones. It would mean improving global cooperation and sharing data more effectively. And it would require a commitment to making sure everyone, no matter where they live or how much money they have, can get the essential health care they need, including vaccines and treatments.
Those are some big goals, but they seem absolutely crucial if we want to create a fairer and more just world. And this brings us back to those lawsuits against Pfizer. While they're focused on one specific vaccine, they're raising bigger questions about the role of pharmaceutical companies, the influence of money in healthcare, and the importance of transparency and accountability.
Exactly. These lawsuits are forcing us to face some uncomfortable truths about how our system works. They're making us ask ourselves some tough questions. Are we doing enough to protect public health? Are we putting profits ahead of people? And are we holding those in power accountable for their actions?
These are questions we all need to grapple with, both individually and as a society. The answers will have a huge impact on the future of global health for generations to come.
I couldn't agree more. And these aren't just abstract philosophical questions. They have real consequences for how we deal with future pandemics, how we develop and distribute those life-saving treatments, and how we create a more just and equitable world for everyone.
It's clear that this is a complex issue with no easy solutions, but one thing's for sure. We need to keep asking these questions, keep demanding transparency, and keep pushing for a system that puts the well-being of all people first.
Absolutely. And that's where you, the listener, come in. We need to hear your voices, your perspectives, and your engagement. What do you think about the role of pharmaceutical companies in global health? What are your thoughts on the influence of organizations like the Gates Foundation? And what steps do you think we need to take to build a healthcare system that's fairer and more just for everyone?
We're genuinely interested in hearing your thoughts. This is a conversation we all need to be a part of, and we believe that everyone can contribute to shaping the future of global health.
And if you have any ideas for future deep dives, we'd love to hear them. We're always exploring new topics and trying to learn more about the world around us.
So please, share your thoughts, your questions, and your ideas. We're all in this together, and we can make a difference if we work together.
We truly believe that knowledge is power, and we're committed to giving you the information and insights you need to navigate these complex issues.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We'll be back next time with another fascinating topic to explore. Until then, stay curious, stay engaged, and stay informed.